early on the 26th of December, 1996, when police arrived to investigate a reported kidnapping at the Ramsey's Colorado home. They thought the parents were behaving strangely. Their suspicion grew that afternoon when John Ramsey discovered his daughter's body in this small cellar.
JonBenet Ramsey was found in the deepest, darkest corner of the Ramsey home. Meanwhile, the ransom note was in the light of the morning sun, which is why the shadow is the greatest teacher for how to come to the light, the true light. When the police returned to the Ramsey home, they tested the idea of an intruder going into JonBenet's room and carrying her downstairs and into the basement. But this is the important part. At night, in the dark. Let's go to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, dealing with this particular aspect. Inside the house, the detectives spent hours running through different scenarios of what might have happened on December 26. Sometimes with the lights on, sometimes with the lights off. They ran the scenarios starting in JonBenet's bedroom, either just before or just after she went to sleep. In each scenario, they took it for granted that either the killer or JonBenet, or perhaps both, knew the route from her bedroom to the wine cellar. From JonBenet's second-floor bedroom, it was less than 4 full paces to the top of the carpeted spiral staircase that led down to the ground floor. The 13 steps of the staircase could have been maneuvered in the dark by someone who knew them. But a visitor or an intruder would need a light, the detectives reasoned, even if they did not have to control a struggling child. A parent or the child would not need a light. They also seemed to determine that the flashlight found on the kitchen counter was normally kept near the kitchen, so you wouldn't have begun your negotiating of the darkness with a flashlight from JonBenet's room. The point of all this is to simply stress that in the dark, in that house, it wasn't easy when you didn't know your way around. So much for the darkness inside the house. What about the ability to look from the outside of the house into the house? This is another excerpt from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. When he looked through the glass panel door, the lights were on and he could see some papers lying on the wooden floor. They were not facing him, but from where he stood, he could read the first few lines of one page. That was all he needed. Anyone know who that is a reference to? It's also interesting that 2 news reporters were able to see this from outside the Ramsey home, which simply by looking through the windows of the Ramsey home, it was crystal clear what the police theory was at the time. Frank Kaufman and Jeff Shapiro, stood on a wooden fence in the backyard and watched as lights in the house were turned on and off. This is by investigators. They saw Detective Gossage with a flashlight in his hand performing a pantomime in which someone found John or Patsy and JonBenet, attacked one or the other. Then, with the flashlight still in hand, Gossage recreated a slightly different scenario in the kitchen. It looked as if the detectives thought the flashlight was the murder weapon. Now think about this. In terms of this recreation, the reporters skulking on the outside could actually tell exactly what was happening simply by looking through the windows. Now think about that, the inverse of that. If you're an intruder, aren't you going to be concerned about what can be seen from the outside? Also, if you're not an intruder, if you're someone else writing a ransom note, carrying JonBenet around, staging whatever is going on, aren't you going to be concerned about what could be seen from the outside? And it's through this lens of lights and windows that we really get a sense of a whole new dimension to the Ramsey case. And in order to fully understand this dimension, it is important to go back to the scene of the crime in order to get a look and feel for the crime scene in terms of this dimension. If the Ramsey case is anything like the Idaho 4 case, if someone was skulking around the neighborhood, watching the house from a vehicle, observing the people inside through the windows, observing JonBenet, biding his time, choosing his moment, well, then we need to return to the scene to get a sense of what that might feel like and where one might get the best vantage point to look in.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So this really is a fascinating area of the Ramsey case. I've certainly thought about it long and hard. I've also gone to the Ramsey home, studied blueprints of the house. In fact, when I stood outside the Ramsey home, I sort of felt like I had x-ray vision and I could see right through the house, rooms, levels, layers. And so in this analysis, I'm going to take you into that dimension of almost having x-ray vision, looking through the house. But in particular, we want to think about the Ramsey home through this dimension, not only of light, but windows. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, it's the last day of January. I was really thinking I'm not going to really carry on with the analysis of this case beyond this month. But I have to say I've also been surprised by your interest and by some of your comments. So it's really up to you. If you guys want me to carry on into February, please let me know in the comments. If you hit the thanks button, that can certainly have an impact on how long we keep this series going. So it's really up to you. I just also want to say a big thank you for all of those who did hit the thanks button and give super thanks. It really does make a difference. Even $1, $2, even that does make a difference. So those of you who have done that, a big thank you from me and a big paw high five from Timmy. And let's get started. So it's important to go back to the scene of a crime, but when you head to the Ramsey home, you see this. It's a little different from what it looked like in December 1996, isn't it? The same is true of the funhouse in Moscow, Idaho. I've been there as well. What struck me when I was there, when the house was still standing, it was boarded up but still there, was that you could almost reach out and touch the balcony. If you were standing at the road, you could almost just stretch forward and actually touch the edge of the house, the room where Maddie and Kaylee were so horribly killed. And there was a big window looking out from Maddie's bedroom over the balcony, over that wooden balcony, onto that road. You could actually see right onto the balcony as well. And it basically looks out essentially over a parking lot as well. Now, this is no small point either in terms of access. In December 1996, if someone wanted to, they could step off the sidewalk in Boulder and walk right up to the window or door, or for that matter, the grate, go right up to the house. But you can't do that today. The house is surrounded by a black wrought iron fence. But going back isn't just about where, it's about when. So it's important to be at the Ramsey house just the same at the house in Moscow, Idaho, at the same time of the year, not only winter around Christmas, but also the same time of day. In this case, again, just as in Idaho, late at night, after midnight. And what happens when you do that? I can tell you, not only does the Ramsey house look different at that time, but so does the whole of Boulder and most other places. They are illuminated with Christmas lights. And this is also why I'm quite critical of Lou Smith's climbing through the basement window, that whole reenactment, which he seems to do in summer. In winter, besides snow and frost on the grass, there's also a lot of debris, leaves and dirt and all that kind of thing. And that just isn't as present in spring or summer. There will also be webs in place during one season totally different to another. Even back then, although the garden was a lot more open than it is today, the Ramseys had a tree and a gardener who raked up such a large pile of leaves, JonBenet asked if she could dive into it. Brian Scott, the Ramsey gardener, quoted by Lawrence Schiller in his book Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, said, "That evening I left a big pile of leaves out front by the gutter for her to play with. That was probably the last time I spoke to JonBenet." Details matter, and so we must approach the question of lights in a similarly detailed manner, and we begin that process by looking at the windows into the Ramsey home. And that brings us to 7 sparkling insights from the lights. Did you know the word light appears over 80 times in Patsy's 1998 police statement? Going to see the Christmas lights was also the last thing the Ramseys did after their dinner, their Christmas Eve dinner at Pastor Jay's restaurant on Pearl Street, after stopping at the White's house. Well, then they went to look at the Christmas lights, including the Christmas star, which floats over Boulder at night over Christmas. Number 1, Ramsey House was like an aquarium. Can you guess how many windows there are in the Ramsey home? Have you ever thought about this? Are there perhaps 20 windows, perhaps 40? Let's take a look at a few images and try to do a proper count, shall we? The correct answer is 104 windows. So for an intruder, 104 opportunities to be seen skulking around from the outside. Number 2, John Fernie read the ransom note through a window, in fact through the kitchen window. Let's go back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. As Fernie drove over, he thought that John must have had a heart attack since Patsy hadn't told his wife what had happened. She just said, "Come over quickly, it's urgent." Fernie parked his car in the alley behind the Ramsey's house and ran to the patio door on the south side, which he always used. And I do think this little story of John Fernie approaching the house is quite important. Like for the people who knew the Ramseys, this is the way they would tend to visit them. They'd park in the back and they wouldn't come through the front. And they wouldn't even enter through the front door. The patio door on the south side was locked. When he looked through the glass panel door, the lights were on and he could see some papers lying on the wooden floor. They were not facing him, but from where he stood he could read the first few lines of one page. That was all he needed. He understood immediately that JonBenet had been kidnapped. Now think about just another scenario here. Imagine the intruder's in the house. He's got the lights on. He's writing the ransom note. And it's Christmas time and someone comes over, because it's Christmas, to visit the Ramseys, which happens a lot over Christmas. And they actually catch the intruder writing the ransom note, right? And wouldn't the intruder be aware of that? I don't want to write the ransom note where I can be seen. I'm not going to write it right next to a window. So where are you going to write it? Number 3, it's easier to see inside a house at night. And again, you can really appreciate this when you go to the Ramsey house at night in December. But you also don't need to be like John Fernie right next to the windows to just know that certain lights were on when they should have been off. And so that's a really important question. What did the neighbors see in terms of lights being on? And as it turns out, and I think we need an ominous booming sound right here, lights were on in the Ramsey house that shouldn't have been that night, and lights were off that shouldn't have been as well. Wow, I see we at over 12 minutes in this video, which is where most attention spans start to wane. Such a pity. The average view duration of the last video was only 7 minutes, 28 seconds. So we're not even through halfway of these 7 sparkling insights from the lights. We'll resume with point number 3 of these 7 insights in the next episode. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.